So I want to start this video with an apology. And maybe apology is the wrong word, but as most of you who have been paying attention the past week will realize, a lot of news has been in the process of breaking for around the past 7 to 10 days. But unfortunately, it wasn't actually confirmed until last night. So this is so ridiculous and so un-Japanese, as I knew the Japanese before this. They didn't put the final details of the policy that was going to go into effect at midnight on October 1st up on the website till about 11:59 p.m. on September 30th, which I thought was interesting considering that they instantly posted the glamour shots of Motegi's trip to Europe on the website. But never mind, I do apologize because I wanted to make another video as soon as possible. I just assumed that it would be possible before this, but I wanted to make sure that I had all the details before I took up any more of your time explaining what the situation was now. So the good news, I guess, is that people from all over the world can now enter Japan. The bad news, at least if you don't have a proper visa and were wanting to visit as a tourist, is that it's people from all over the world who are not tourists who can come. So essentially, if you have a visa that you applied for at a Japanese embassy as opposed to a visa exemption, and that visa is good for 3 months or longer, and is for any purpose from work to study to cultural activities to so on and so forth, you will be able to enter Japan so long as you adhere to certain requirements. I'll talk more about when tourists might be able to visit in just a little bit, but unfortunately that's not now. But yeah, so to go over the specifics, essentially, if you do fall into one of those categories, and I'll link the page on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website in the description of this video, but if you fall into one of those categories, so work, study, long-term business trip, relocation, expat, so on and so forth, basically everything except tourist, and I might add, except for the Love is Not Tourism people, which does kind of sting because they've been pushing really hard for this. You basically need to submit a certain range of documents and also follow a certain range of procedures. So the documents to be submitted are your eligible visa, so your certificate of pre-enter PCR testing, and if you click the link that I'm going to include in the description, you'll see the specifications about that. But essentially, it needs to just be taken 72 hours before your departure to Japan. Thankfully, not your arrival to Japan, because with the way flights are these days, it can take half a day or a full day to get to Japan from where you are. So that gives you a little bit of extra time. You need to make a written pledge, and not so much you, but the organization that will be receiving you in Japan, so your company, your school, I guess your spouse, if you're married to a Japanese national, you're going to need to submit this pledge that states that you will adhere to the quarantine requirements. And then you will receive a questionnaire either on the airplane or, depending on how it's rolled out by the time you enter Japan, there is an online version that's being trialed because, of course, one of Prime Minister Suga's initiatives when he assumed the prime ministership was digitizing Japan at long last. So in terms of the procedures you need to follow, you basically need to take your own temperature and monitor yourself for symptoms 14 days before your departure. If you have any symptoms or you get a temperature, you're supposed to cancel your trip to Japan. You need to take out private medical insurance to cover yourself while you're in Japan. Now, obviously, I know some schools and companies allow you to get onto Japan's national health insurance during your stay in Japan. However, that usually takes about 30 days to go into effect, so you do need to have a private policy that will cover you in that gap period. You need to follow up by monitoring your health during your entire quarantine, and there will be a line conversation that you can report those details to. You need to install a COVID-19 tracking application, and then you need to retain your location data on your phone via a map app. I have no idea whether that's Apple Maps, Google Maps, or some homegrown Japan Maps app, but you basically need to follow all those things as well in addition to the documentation. So that is quite a few hoops to jump through. This is not going to be appealing to everybody, but if you really want to get into Japan from today, October 1st, 2020, you will be able to do so. So now that we've gone over the basics, I just spoke for 5 minutes about that, the basics of this arrangement, I wanted to talk about some more intricacies as well as some frequently asked questions that I've received. So, one of the things that was publicized during the press conferences about this new arrangement that actually notably is absent from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website is this idea of a quota. So, I guess the initial reports were stating that there was going to be a quota of 1,000 people per day allowed into Japan under this new scheme from the whole world, and then from 16 Asia Pacific countries with which Japan has already started negotiating. There was going to be an additional quota of 1,600 people, which in a later announcement was increased to 2,000. So that would be a total of 3,000 per day from all over the world, 2,000 from Asia and 1,000 from the rest. Now, what I've gleaned in the absence of the information on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website from a wonderful Japan Times journalist called Magdalena Osumi, who you guys should all follow if you don't, and you should all thank her because she has been a tireless ally in our fight to get into Japan. She basically said that that 1,000 or 2,000 or whatever that quota was just a guideline. Really, the number of people allowed in is going to be dictated by the testing capacity at a given point, which by this point is supposed to be about 10,000 per day. It's supposed to be around 20,000 by the end of November. Who knows what the capacity actually is. But the great thing is you don't need to worry about that quota too much, because that's going to be regulated first and foremost by the way that visas are approved, the number of visas that are approved a day, and the way they're rolled out at the embassies, and then number two by the flight schedules and the flight capacity. So it's not like you're gonna, if you make it all the way to Japan and you have all your documents intact, you're not gonna be turned back at the border. We hope not. Just make sure that your test results has negative instead of not detected. But it's not like they're gonna have a ticker and then when they get to person number 1001 on a given day, they're just gonna say, sorry, come back tomorrow. And then here's the other thing. So I mentioned earlier talking about the number of hoops you have to jump through with this. I personally, after this initial rush of people that have been locked out for a few months gets handled, which I think will occur within a month or two, I don't think there's gonna be a long line of people knocking on the doors of Japan with all these conditions in place. Like, obviously, if you're watching this video, if you've been following things on Twitter, if you're a member of a Facebook group, you're very passionately invested and involved in this, and I salute you because I am too. But most people are not like us. Most students have moved on. They have found another place to study that has less onerous restrictions. Many professionals, whether they were locked out of re-entry or from coming in the first place, have moved on. They've gone to countries that are more hospitable. Most people who didn't have an extremely passionate drive to relocate to Japan and to be in Japan have probably abandoned their plans, or they're willing to put them on hold until the pandemic is over. So I don't think it's going to be a matter of there being thousands of people banging down Japan's door every day from now until Kingdom Come. So I wouldn't really worry too much about that aspect of it. The second question that I get a lot is people asking me, oh my God, are they going to roll this back? And to answer that question, I would start with a paraphrase of something a person in one of my Facebook groups said, which I thought was so brilliant. He was talking about the fact that as they've been ever so slowly rolling back the century ban, the Olympics were kind of an obstacle for us because, for better or for worse, holding the Olympics next year on schedule seemed to be Japan's highest priority, and everything else seemed to be subservient to that. And so that arguably delayed both the creation and the implementation of these plans. However, he said that they've gone from being an obstacle to being insurance, which I agree with. And basically, I think what he meant by that is this idea that if Japan has waited all this time, they roll out this elaborate plan, they roll out a red carpet with spikes on it to the rest of the world, and finally people who have a non-tourism authorization to Japan can finally enter. If they go to all this trouble, they wait all this time, and then they renege on their promises, politically that would kill the Olympics. And now, granted, Japan seems to have been able to play by special rules this whole time that are not afforded to any other country, so I don't know if countries are going to hold them accountable for that, but I think that they wouldn't have rolled this out if they didn't view it as being long-term sustainable. Like, even if there is a massive second wave around the world, a big spike in Japan, I think they figure that this system they've created is foolproof. And it is. I mean, you test before departure, you test after arrival, you quarantine for 14 days. I mean, I'm not an epidemiologist, but from everything I know about COVID, if anything, that's overkill. No infections are going to slip through from that. So no, I don't think that this is going to be rolled back. I think what would happen, though, is if there is some sort of hiccup, I think it would simply delay the expansion of it. And to get to my third question, which sort of ties into that, is this idea of when tourism is going to resume. So to take you back to my last video, I talked about this policy change that Motegi was telegraphing, or I thought he was telegraphing. Nothing came of it. Ended up being a giant nothing burger. But basically, he had talked about the idea that Japan was going to lower what's called the infectious disease alert level for a number of countries, primarily in the Asia Pacific, which, if that happened at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that would mean the Justice Ministry would roll back the denial of landing permission to those countries. And theoretically, as long as you were willing to quarantine, you'd be able to travel from those countries to Japan without any prior authorization or reason. So if you, for example, were coming from one of the countries like US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, meaning your passport's from that country, where the visa exemption is still intact, and you were coming from one of the 16 safe countries, theoretically you could come to Japan as a tourist if you were willing to stay in quarantine for 2 weeks. But unfortunately, nothing has come of that. That was supposed to happen October 1st, and aside from an article in Nikkei on Monday and then a couple parroting that article in Kyoto and Japan Times, I've heard nothing else about that. And I think that even when it does happen, because of this other arrangement that's been put into place, I am doubtful that tourists would be able to avail that. So putting that aside and assuming nothing comes of that, and if it does, I'll make a new video, I would assume, more generally, conceptually, I think that Japan is going to wait as long as possible and as close as possible to the Olympics before allowing tourists back in, because again, you can't unring that bell. But here's what I would say. I would say with those 16 countries, and it might be expanded a little bit, but with the countries that are deemed safe where the infection isn't spreading uncontrolled, I would say conservatively, they're probably going to start letting tourists in from the end of the first quarter 2021 to the beginning of the second quarter. So right around the beginning of cherry blossom season. And the reason I say this is a few reasons. I think number one, if it was just from a financial perspective, it might make sense to allow tourists in for the autumn color season, so end of October, early November, late November, depending on what part of Japan you're talking about, or the Hokkaido ski season around Christmas, New Year's, and in January. But unfortunately, I think because most people expect there to be some kind of second wave due to the way that respiratory viruses spread around that time of year, I think Japan's going to avoid having people that are difficult to track in the country at that time. And I think that by the time cherry blossom season comes around, not only is the weather going to be getting warmer and the trend of respiratory disease infections are going to be reversing anyway, COVID or otherwise, but I think that we're going to have progress on the vaccine and therapeutic front. I mean, we could have vaccines rolled out for general use in some countries by that point. And I think it's going to be close enough to the Olympics where even if there was a cataclysm that resulted from allowing those people in, it would sort of be too late to do anything about it at that point. Now, in terms of who's going to be allowed in at that point and what the circumstances are going to be, I don't know. I mean, personally, I would say it's certainly going to be testing 72 hours before departure, testing upon arrival. I imagine to begin with, there will be some sort of quarantine upon arrival. I mean, they might do like some European countries are doing now and have a 7-day quarantine. It might be like they're doing for the nascent business track program, where there's not a quarantine per se, but you have to have a detailed itinerary. You're not allowed to use public transport, and you have to have some entity, I guess a hotel or a tour company in this situation, that would vouch for you. I don't know how that's going to work, but I would be surprised if tourists are allowed in before about March of next year. I'd be pleasantly surprised. I'd be happy because I know that a lot of you who aren't necessarily students or employees or workers or whatever who really want to get back to Japan, I feel for you because I'm in the same boat. I mean, I'm a student in waiting, but I'm also a tourist. I'm also a business person. I have every reason in the world to want to be back in Japan. And that sort of gets me to my last point, which is a little bit of a personal note, which is that although this arrangement has come about where people are now able to enter Japan from today, unfortunately, I'm going to have to wait till January. So as you will know if you've been watching these videos, if you follow Japan Starts Here or my other websites, I've been living in Taiwan for about the past year and a half. And it's been lovely, especially during the pandemic, because life has basically been normal here. Well, unfortunately, my stay in Taiwan expires tomorrow, and just for legal and immigration reasons, I have to leave. And so basically, in order to convert my COE into a visa, I'm gonna have to go back to the United States and do that. And just because of the various hurdles involved in doing that, I just decided it would be better to go ahead and wait until January to move, which of course also the good part about that is that allows me to spend the holidays with my family, with my dog nephew, maybe do a little bit of traveling in the States to see friends and other people, depending on what the infection situation is. Although I'm going to be super careful because I don't want to get COVID and then be unable to enter Japan in January after waiting for almost a year to do so. But anyway, that being said, although that's kind of sad for me because I would love to be on a plane to Japan today, the good news is that I'm not going to rest until I'm in Japan and until all of you are in Japan. So the fact that I'm going to be out of Japan for at least the next 2.5 months means that I'm going to stay on this case. I'm going to keep making videos. I'm going to keep diving deep, and I hope you'll keep watching. For those of you who are able to enter Japan now, finally, I'm so happy for you. I can't wait to hear about all your experiences and live vicariously through you and selfishly learn from your mistakes. And for those of you who still have to keep waiting, I have to keep waiting too. We're in this together. So I look forward to more good news. I look forward to things moving forward, to things opening up. And most importantly, beyond Japan and this entire discussion, this fucking pandemic being over at long last. So yeah, good news, not perfect news, not good news for everybody, but I can say for the first time in a long time, I really feel like we're moving pretty momentously in the right direction. So it's wonderful. See you next time. Bye.